Out of all the streaming services, Disney Plus has had one of the most rocky roads from launch, and it turns out that the behind the scenes of the platform is a lot more dire than we could have imagined. I've been gearing up to do an overall Disney Plus breakdown video, but the thing that really springboarded this into existence is a new article released by The Hollywood Reporter that sheds light on a lot of major issues behind the scenes that have been negatively impacting MCU shows. So I'll be covering a lot of information revealed from this article, while also rounding up numerous other articles that go into the controversies behind the scenes. And I'll link all this information into general big issues with Disney Plus's content strategy for the MCU and Star Wars. So the first and most damning revelation brought up by The Hollywood Reporter is that none of the MCU shows have had actual showrunners. First, I should probably describe the role of a showrunner because it can get a little confusing as to who's in control of the creative vision given so many positions like directors, writers, producers, and executive producers that have a say in how a show is made. The showrunner essentially has full creative authority over a series and manages every aspect about a show from the writing, filming, and editing. And it's up to them if they want to personally be involved with writing and directing certain episodes. Producers and executive producers are technically higher on the food chain, but their creative input entails finding people to work on a project and supervise the process to see if everything is running smoothly and is also on budget. However, Marvel on the other hand didn't even bother with acquiring showrunners. They generally approached directors and asked them to pitch shows, and they were normally not heavily involved with the writing process. The primary director of Moon Knight, Mohamed Diab, said he was approached out of the blue by Marvel and asked for him to pitch the series. From here, they didn't actually make him the showrunner and brought on more creatives to help lighten the workload. Luckily, Moon Knight is an example of this actually working to a degree, but a bad example where this was a similar case was Secret Invasion. Now, it was largely a mystery as to why Secret Invasion was so expensive and looked the least remarkable and most cheap of the MCU shows. But it turns out that the show was utterly plagued with production issues and had a staggering 4 months of reshoots, along with the producers bringing on a new writer during that period to write new material. So they essentially remade a solid chunk of Secret Invasion in that time. To go into more detail behind the scenes for Secret Invasion, the worrying signs started with Kyle Bradstreet writing scripts for the show for almost a year, until Marvel spontaneously decided that they wanted to take the show in a different direction and drop-kicked him out of the series. They hired a few directors and a new writer, and allegedly none of them got along during pre-production. It was an absolute shitstorm as this unproductive crew worked inefficiently, and by a certain point, they were burning through their allotted schedule to the point that they lost one of the directors due to scheduling conflicts, forcing Ali Selim to now direct every episode, on top of most of the people working on the show getting replaced. The Marvel executive who was overseeing Secret Invasion upset the company so much to the point that his contract will not be getting renewed. So, Secret Invasion was an absolute nightmare behind the scenes, and I think is one of the straws that broke the camel's back for Marvel in realizing that this model is not sustainable, along with it fundamentally delivering a worse product because by having so many conflicting creative opinions, the show will feel like a mess as everyone tries to get on the same page. Secret Invasion was this hideous Frankenstein baby that failed to deliver on the premise of the show, and was this weird mashup of crappy spy espionage, half-assed paranoia, and so much more that I dive into for a 20-minute video I'll put in the end screen if you're interested.
Oh Lord. Well.
Then there's also the issue that Disney didn't hire on more Marvel executives to oversee TV shows that suddenly landed on their doorsteps because of Disney Plus. Instead, the existing executives working for Marvel had to split their time between the movies and the shows, which this piece of information to me is a major reason why Marvel has quickly been going off a cliff in terms of quality. They essentially doubled their output of Marvel content overnight, and they were clearly not ready to handle the massive amount of work. Because before this, they had 2 or 3 movies a year they had to worry about, along with those movies just being around 2 hours. So actually, they more than tripled the amount of content they had to worry about, because the shows generally run for around 4 to 5 hours. Like, you'd probably be surprised if I told you in 2021, Disney Plus released 5 MCU shows. At a certain point, there must have been well over a dozen Marvel projects being worked on at a single time. From here, Kevin Feige probably couldn't be as involved as he would want to be with most of these projects. It seems like he put his faith in the creatives despite there not being showrunners. So the scripts clearly deteriorated, and there have been a plethora of writing problems on almost every MCU project coming up, especially Blade, which seems to be in a perpetual hell of writing. Now, the proof that points to Kevin Feige most likely not having enough supervision over MCU content is what just happened with Daredevil Born Again. This event was a major talking point for the Hollywood Reporter article. It reveals Marvel firing all the writers and directors on the series because Feige disliked the direction and quality of the show. Funnily enough, the writer's strike actually gave Feige some breathing room and allowed him to fully review the first 4 episodes that were shot before the production shut down. And since he didn't like what he saw, which apparently Matt Murdock doesn't actually put on his suit until episode 4, and it was just a legal drama basically, he hit the reset button on the show. So thankfully the strike led to more great things besides giving writers significantly better contracts. The strike saved a fan-favorite show from possibly another Secret Invasion-esque fate. Without the strike, it's likely that this show would have continued shooting without a guarantee as to whether it would have been good. Generally in television, you would make a pilot episode, which would act as the first episode of the series that you would then show to the producers to greenlight the rest of the season. Or if they didn't like the pilot, they'd save money and say no by not continuing production on the entire show. Because it's fundamentally better to lose money on one episode instead of funding a multi-hour long failure. Marvel, however, didn't do this, and just greenlighted shows on the faith that the creatives were hopefully competent enough to work on the project, the scripts were finished and passable, and in general they started floating this notion that any issues they'd run into in production, they could fix in post. Which is an utter nightmare for anyone working in the industry. It leads to a lazy form of filmmaking with not enough planning being done, and it also sends VFX artists into a frenzy because inexperienced directors are constantly making changes on already finished shots with VFX. Or producers are finally seeing the finished product and are now throwing in their own notes for changes, thus adding to the budget and forcing those artists to crunch even more. When people bash bad VFX in Marvel movies, and is this major reason as to why these movies or shows are bad, I just feel disconnected by the conversation because the artists making these shots are actually very talented and are being rushed to finish their work. Most people will always point out the bad VFX, but to be fair, they do deliver some genuinely great shots that look incredible at times. It just unfortunately breaks your immersion when those occasional bad shots do arise. Like, it's been reported that Marvel Productions are regularly making changes on their projects right up until the deadline, which just seems insane to me because with proper planning and pre-production, that should never be the case. Your movie or show should be perfectly planned out to the point that you don't drive up the budget of the show while simultaneously hurting the quality. However, this takes time, and since Marvel Studios essentially had a quota of about 3 shows a year, they didn't have the luxury of time, so therefore the quality started to tank. Even though it seems counterproductive to have a lack of planning and then go through months of reshoots. All of this amalgamates into Marvel feeling more like a conveyor belt of content instead of something that is more driven by creativity and passion. We do occasionally get those shows like Loki and Moon Knight, but other shows like WandaVision, which were good, clearly had some really inconsistent patches like the ending that just felt like a complete mess. Or the obvious elephant in the room that is Secret Invasion, in which Marvel just tossed $200 million off to a group of creatives in hopes that they'd return with a good show. So since we've essentially assessed the absolute chaos behind the scenes at Disney Plus and why so much of their content has been lacking, let's now see how this impacts the streaming service as a whole and the major issues that creates. Going into the biggest problem is that for both Marvel and Star Wars, Disney is flooding the market with so much content to the point that they are oversaturating and damaging their brand. Now, this is a very nuanced subject that I'll elaborate on, and there is definitely another side to this coin. And that side is what James Gunn brings up, in that people aren't getting superhero fatigue, and instead they are getting bad writing or bad story fatigue. For me, I pretty much agree with the sentiment because if we kept getting S-tier Marvel content like Winter Soldier, Thor Ragnarok, and Guardians of the Galaxy, then people would be perfectly happy. Those movies were all refreshing and told great stories that were imbued with so much creativity and love, and their follow-ups were all generally pretty good, and I feel like Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is living proof that people aren't fatigued by overall superhero movies. Like, if I were to personally rank Phase 4, it would look something like this. And in comparison, this is how I would rank the first 3 phases, which is a pretty depressing contrast. People are much more aware to the deteriorating quality of the content, to the point that reviews now make or break Marvel movies. That's why Ant-Man Quantumania did poorly at the box office, because critics and fans ripped that movie apart, leaving people on the fence to either skip it entirely or wait until it comes out on Disney Plus. Despite Quantumania having some hype marketing, marketing, and that they were introducing Kang as the new big threat. So this waning quality paired with a drastic uptick in content on Disney Plus is what's driving the community to this burnt out view. Then, another aspect for the MCU in particular is that the universe is exponentially expanding to an alarming degree, with so many new characters and plot threads to the point that it's overwhelming. For every show, they seemingly create more loose ends than they do for plotlines they conclude. To go through some examples, WandaVision establishes 4 separate plotlines, some of which have no clear plan for the future, like White Vision being set loose into the world. Hawkeye oddly sets up a lot of different plotlines. New characters sometimes show up out of the blue, like in She-Hulk where Hulk randomly has a son now. Secret Invasion introduces the most overpowered character in the MCU, who will show up at some other point, I guess. And even shows that are meant to be a miniseries end up concluding on a cliffhanger. Actually, looking back at Moon Knight, I completely forgot that this character became a superhero. Then this isn't even bringing into account the usual end credit scene introductions for the movies. At this point, it feels like cutting off the head of a Hydra, in which when one story ends, 2 more take its place. On top of all of this being compounded by Disney Plus adding more wood to the fire. This does vary per person because fans who watch every show or movie may not care as much, but for casuals it's really uninviting. You now have to ingest dozens of hours of content just to understand where these characters came from. The Marvels, as an example, features 2 characters that originated in 2 separate shows, each over 4 hours long. So to understand the complexities and context for these characters, you need to watch their shows. Or you have a situation like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, where fans who didn't watch WandaVision were confused about why Wanda was suddenly a villain. The Marvels may not require you to watch Ms. Marvel and WandaVision to understand these new characters, because they'll probably reintroduce them in a new way that's digestible for casual moviegoers. But that notion will always be in the back of your head that you're missing a part of their story. Because at the end of the day, you miss an entire arc that these characters went on in their own shows. This stayed in comparison to the first few phases were much more casual viewer friendly. All we had were a small handful of characters that took on conflict that wasn't too overwhelming from an overarching story perspective. The dynamics between these characters had a significant amount of depth, and were all able to be explored to a good extent. Like, I'd honestly be surprised if we ever get a deeply personal moment again, where Tony Stark found out that Bucky killed his parents. I know we're primarily in a phase where we're setting things up again, but with so many more characters, it's hard to imagine them getting back to that level of depth that we had between Iron Man and Captain America. Now, I just shudder at the thought of anyone trying to write or direct the next Avengers movie because the amount of characters has more than doubled. Infinity War did an excellent job balancing out its cast of characters, but the question is, will that still work for the next Avengers movie if we bring in every superhero we've been setting up? There's almost no way we can go back to that level of detail from the earlier phases, because by doing that, you'll have to cut out a lot of screen time for other heroes. Which begs the question, why introduce so many if they aren't going to be that important later on? I know this is a comic book thing where you have like 100 characters, but I'd argue that's more unsustainable in a movie or show setting. People tend to want quality over quantity, and the current track record for Disney Plus has shown us that we can't have both. Taking a look over at Star Wars, there are obviously many issues for each project that generally have to do with the writing, but I want to take a look at a larger problem with their shows on Disney Plus, and that's the lack of creative and new ideas for the franchise. Now, there are very few like The Mandalorian, but even that show has devolved into bringing back likable characters that in turn deteriorates their strong payoff earlier in the story. Every single show essentially takes place within one time period of the universe because that is where these recognizable characters are, and thus, more people will pay to watch it. That's just the sad truth because there's nothing that will inherently draw in a ton of viewers right away if a show doesn't have major recognizable characters in them. Like Ahsoka as an example included Anakin Skywalker, and the entire fandom lost their collective minds and thought it was the best thing ever. So when Disney is at a crossroads of making original stories with new characters, or mining the nostalgia of fans with bringing back existing popular characters, you could probably guess which path they will take. It more or less stifles creativity when you force future stories through a bottleneck when there are so many other eras within the universe you can explore. Disney has said that they are planning on doing that, but given that they are cutting back on producing more shows, it's unclear how many we're really going to get given that Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau are taking up a lot of the real estate. The Acolyte is promising, but that seems to still be far away. Besides that, the current state of Star Wars has been extremely rough, and the only show that has been truly great is Andor. And sadly, that show didn't perform well because it didn't have an iconic character backing it, and it also probably hurt that people are burnt out on the Rebels storyline, despite the show genuinely having some outstanding dramatic writing. So we're at a point where the other half of content on Disney Plus has people mostly tired of it and desperately wanting something new and refreshing. Also, it's not necessarily a bad thing to tell stories of existing characters like Obi-Wan. The issue, however, arises when someone doesn't have an original or great vision for the series, and Disney forces and rushes the show into existence. Or if they do have a good vision, Disney may step in, jerry-rig it into a happy, light-hearted miniseries when it was supposed to be a darker movie akin to Logan, which in turn angers the fans who want to love your franchise. This is essentially going into the next point in that a lot of miniseries on Disney Plus feel like they would have been better suited to be movies. At a certain point, you have to ask yourself, is it better to have a $150 to $200 million budget for 6 to 8 episodes that have unnecessary elements and a slow pace, or just condense it down to a solid 2-hour plus movie that is of a much higher quality? Because the production value for a lot of these shows feels cheap at times, and that really comes through for any action scene. It has the rushed and lazy TV show feel, and this is felt the most in Star Wars, where lightsaber fights are supposed to be elaborately crafted with great choreography, dynamic movements, awe-inspiring settings, and more. But on a TV show schedule and budget, the creators don't have enough time in rehearsal to get footage that looks great. So to partially get around this, the action is in turn not as high effort, leading to what feels like an overall downgrade. Or narratively, a lot of these shows were initially being written as movies, and then management busted through the door and saw potential to up Disney Plus's catalog. Examples being Obi-Wan and Secret Invasion. Maybe then Secret Invasion could actually afford to include more characters within its story, because that kind of premise desperately needed more than just Rhodey and Everett Ross showing up. But the reality is that these actors are very expensive, so even though Secret Invasion has a large budget, they sadly can't afford a large roster of characters that the MCU has. Which does seem kind of counterproductive in that you've introduced and brought in so many characters, but having multiple of them in your shows or movies would be too expensive because their price tags are in the millions. There are only a small handful of shows like WandaVision, Loki, She-Hulk despite my dislike for it, and Andor that feel like they were specifically made for TV. And if they were movies, it would only be a downgrade for their stories. They earn their time because every episode is extremely productive in terms of its narrative and how it grows their characters. They have wide sprawling and fun stories instead of something that is stretched out to fit 6 episodes. Looking at you, Jon Favreau. The Book of Boba Fett could have easily just been a movie, and maybe then they'd actually try to make their action scenes look half decent. This seems to primarily be the management of who's running these shows, because when you look over at HBO, shows like House of the Dragon that have a similar budget feel significantly better and of a higher quality than anything Disney Plus has to offer. I used to think that it was just the directors who were butchering these shows, when in reality, the fault probably goes much higher and wider than that. Although some directors are clearly worse than others. Disney Plus does have their occasional gems, but most of them seem to be isolated cases of Disney stumbling onto a passionate creator that genuinely want to make something outstanding, instead of their usual current affairs where the studio comes up with an idea and finds someone to make it who doesn't have a story that's deeply engaging. The crazy thing is, this was essentially the inception of The Force Awakens, where Disney forced a sequel to happen, and the writers had no idea what to do, so they essentially just copied A New Hope. We're at a point where people are starting to despise the 2 types of content that Disney Plus has to offer, and this goes into my final point for Disney Plus's overall issues, which is simply, Disney Plus only has Marvel and Star Wars content. They basically have no other high quality and sought after original shows with unique stories that people want to watch. When you look at every other platform, their most popular show tends to be an original series that balloons into having immense popularity, like Netflix having Stranger Things, Apple having Ted Lasso or Severance, Amazon Prime having The Boys, and really any shows on HBO at this point. But for Disney Plus, they seem to be putting all of their eggs into two baskets. And even shows that they do make, like Willow, that aren't based on Marvel or Star Wars, they instantly cancel and immediately remove off of their streaming service, as if they are deeply embarrassed by it. Not saying that that show was good or anything. I don't think anyone even watched that show or wanted it. It just seems like a baffling decision to give an obscure and niche IP its own show with a $100 million budget. Again, going back to them probably needing to make pilots for their shows and having higher quality assurance. Currently, the only big show coming out on Disney Plus that isn't Marvel or Star Wars related is another adaptation of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I hope this show is good, but given that Disney Plus has garnered a bad reputation for low quality shows, I'm not exactly excited for this series when normally I would be. It's kind of sad, but you can only disappoint fans for so long until they cut ties to your streaming service, which is pretty surprising considering that Disney Plus has really only been around for a few years. So I don't necessarily want to end this video on a depressing and gloomy note of Disney Plus and the content they're making being terrible, because at least on the side of MCU content, they are making strides to do better. They're going to start hiring showrunners for upcoming shows who have a more consistent and creative vision so that there isn't a constant frenzy behind the scenes. They're going to start hiring more TV executives so they aren't stretched thin between movies and shows. It's rumored that Kevin Feige is going to start hiring more tried and tested talent instead of relative unknowns, mainly because by hiring new directors, there's a bit of uncertainty as to whether they'll perform well, so they end up needing to be supervised more. They've also seemed to be hiring more experienced writers, like Nick Pizzolatto for Blade, who was the writer for True Detective, and Lee Sung-jin for Thunderbolts, who wrote Beef. So they probably won't take another chance on someone like Jeff Loveness again, who wrote Ant-Man Quantumania, because prior to that, his primary experience was writing some Rick and Morty episodes. Then finally, they're going to start focusing on more serialized TV. This means shows will be geared towards multiple seasons, instead of miniseries that are unsure about whether or not they're getting another season. So these 4 changes will hopefully lead to better and more fine-tuned shows on Disney Plus. The writing itself will still be a major indicator for quality obviously, but at least the environment for making this content won't be so hospitable. Also, another major change coming to Disney Plus is that it's going to be combined with Hulu in an attempt to increase the value of the overall package. The main reason this is happening is because Disney Plus hasn't made any money since it started. It's been operating at a constant loss every quarter, some of which Disney has lost $500 million to even $1 billion. This was honestly a pretty major revelation to me, and it also seems that the service is starting to go down a spiral in that, for the last 2 quarters, they reported losses for subscribers. Disney Plus does have over 146 million subscribers, which is the 3rd highest, so it's kind of surprising that they're losing this much money. Probably points to the behind the scenes of the service being even worse than what we just went over in this video. So yeah, I'll end it here since the video is getting really long. I didn't want to go on an unhinged MCU rant, and wanted to provide some kind of new perspective. So hopefully this video was informative in some way. Thank you for watching, and check out my socials for Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon in the description.